You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you for another week. It's the last day of June, which means we are gearing up for football. Next month, we will have Big 12 Media Days. Utah football will start fall camp, the very end of July. But we're there. We're close. So soon enough, we're going to be talking real football. Not a lot of this offseason drama, and I say drama with it's just been a lot of drama. We'll say that. So it's we're getting close to football. That's all we can ask for. But I hope you're having a good summer. The holidays are coming up this week that you hopefully get to spend time with family, vacations, whatever it may be. But I do appreciate you for listening if you are listening in the summer. And we'll get this going. So today we're going to do a little update on BYU Jake Retzlaff situation. I know that's not a Utah thing, but it has some impact. And then a little conversation that I had with the men's basketball coaches, a look at the commits Utah got while also highlighting what to watch for on the football side. And then the final iteration of the Utah football schedule breakdown with a look at Kansas State and Kansas. So we'll jump into that. But first, let me tell you about our partners, Canyon View Credit Union. Every possibility begins with a spark, and possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, U First Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump into it today. So we're going to start with Jake Retzlaff. And the reason I'm starting with this is because it was a busy weekend in relation to that. And I wanted to make sure that as we were doing these schedule updates, once this was released, we would know, because this is obviously a high-interest game for Utah, having it be the rivalry and such. But there's just a lot of stuff that goes into it. So the Jake Retzlaff stuff has been settled to an extent, and I'll get to that. So on Friday, he filed a response to the civil suit. The lawyer essentially said everything was consensual, had a whole bunch of stuff that went into it. It's an interesting filing, leaning into the consensual side and the quote-unquote pleasure that was felt between the two of them. I'm not going to go into any more of that. But it was, his response essentially saying that this was a consensual situation. So you had that. And then on Sunday, there were reports that he was going to be handed down a 7-game suspension, and that, however it all shook out, that wasn't something that he wanted to be a part of, and has essentially told everybody that he's transferring. So that's not official yet. There hasn't been any official news from that, nor has there been an official statement about what a suspension would have looked like had he stayed at BYU. And this is more based on the honor code and all that stuff. Obviously, the honor code there at BYU prevents anybody, including student athletes, from engaging in premarital sex. And so that would apply to him, and so that's where he would have the issues outside of just the legal situation. And then this morning, there was a joint dismissal of the civil suit between Retzlaff and the accuser, and it was filed with prejudice. The case was signed this morning, and prejudice just essentially means that the accuser can't refile the same claim in the court. So for all intents and purposes, this is done in terms of a civil suit. There could be other stuff, but I would imagine that this is done. So there's a lot of drama as it relates to that, because as part of Retzlaff, his response, there was some allegations made about this individual and that it was coming from the University of Utah, and there was incidents there that basically were extortion. And so I'm not going to get into all that, right? Like this is not something that we need to get into, but there's a lot that still goes on beyond this. It's settled, so it's essentially done, but there's going to be a lot of drama that comes out of this. So, be prepared for it, I guess. At the end of the day, this is a very terrible situation. It's a lose-lose situation all around. You could have a situation where Retzlaff really did it and, is not a good person in the sense that, he sexually assaulted somebody. On the other hand, you have a woman that accused him of, doing this, and if she was making it up, which many are alleging because of that, it's a terrible situation, one, because you tarnished the name of somebody, as well as you have now made it much more difficult for women who already have a difficult time trying to convince people that their sexual assault was real. This just damages it even further. So it's a lose-lose situation all around. This is not a good situation for anybody involved. I would hope that wasn't like this is the situation, right? Like, I would hope that it's true in the sense that the woman isn't just making it up for extortion, but at the same time it sucks because then you have somebody that is a very bad person. Like, it's a bad situation all around. It's not a good situation. I know some people want to say that Utah orchestrated this to try to get their quarterback out. The reality is if that's the level of petty that this is getting into, it's a very bad situation. And I don't think that Utah would be involved in that. I'm not saying that it couldn't be, but at the same time, that's a very bad situation for anybody to be in. It's not something that people should be toying with just for a football game, which partially leads me to believe that this wasn't the case, but crazier things have happened. I just hope for whatever situation I don't know what to hope, honestly. I mean, it's a terrible situation all around. But at the end of the day, it sounds like Jake Retzlaff is gone and that BYU will be starting a new quarterback this year. So all the previews that we did a couple weeks ago talking about that game, it will not involve Jake Retzlaff, barring some crazy thing happening. But even then, there's suspensions and other stuff that would happen if he stayed, which means that BYU will be turning to either McKay Hillstead, a local product who obviously had some success at Utah State in his short stint there. If I remember right, he only had 4 games that he started there and did okay, but had a lot of turnovers and didn't have a high completion percentage. Obviously more mature, has been in the system, can understand things a little bit better now, or at least that's the thought. And then you have Bear Bachmeier, who is a freshman, obviously has a lot more of a ceiling, a higher ceiling, I would say, than Hillstead does, but he hasn't taken any real snaps at the D1 level. So BYU is going to be in a tough situation here. Do you go with Hillstead, who has some experience, but may not have the same ceiling that Bachmeier has, or do you just rip off the Band-Aid and just go with Bachmeier? It's a tough situation for them. So really fascinating to see what happens there with BYU. We'll know a ton of this by the time we get to that game. We may even know, well, we're not going to know anymore next week when there's Big 12 Media Day, but there's going to be a lot of questions asked about that. There's going to be a lot of conversations had. And so we'll learn what Kalani Sitake has for them at QB and kind of the direction that they're heading. But I have to imagine this goes into fall camp and, trying to name somebody a week or two into fall camp to try to get them ready for the season. So fortunately for BYU, their schedule isn't the most difficult this year, but that's not to say that either one of these quarterbacks wouldn't be, tough, right? You've got a situation where you've got experience, but at the same time, what can it be? So it's hard to know. It's hard to know what any of this will mean for BYU, but, definitely a different situation for them going into the year than what they were expecting to have Retzlaff there, expecting him to be able to be an even better player than he was last year. And so a blow to the university for sure, but one that they've been preparing for a while. So let's end that. This isn't a BYU podcast. I know you don't want to hear that if you're a Utah fan, but there are things that you have to update. So next up, last week the media got an opportunity to have a little off-the-record meet and greet with Alex Jensen and Wes Wilcox. Wes Wilcox is the new general manager for the men's basketball program, and Alex is obviously the head coach. I can't really give details, but I will say that these two are heavily in sync. Anything that goes through this program, these two are, locked in together. They think pretty similarly, but at the same time, they challenge each other in a way that doesn't just give that groupthink, right? They're not just doing whatever they feel like that the two of them like. They're also bringing in anybody on their staff. This isn't one of those things where they're the only ones with the plans and everybody else be damned. they absolutely want the impact from anybody. And Rafael Chilius, Chills as many call him, has been heavily involved in this as well. Obviously, he's got a lot of experience in the collegiate ranks, and so they're going to lean heavily on that. But at the same time, they're going to view this from a very different perspective. Alex Jensen said when he came in his intro press conference that, he's going to view this from an NBA standard, right? And Wes Wilcox is coming in as an assistant general manager at the Sacramento Kings. And so these two are going to view this in very much so the mindset of a professional program. And so they're going to try to run it in that mindset. Now, recognizing that there's still a collegiate, flair to this, they have to adapt, and they fully recognize that they don't have all the answers for that, right? But at the same time, they're going to run this very much so the same as a business. And so, whether it be negotiations or whether it be building a roster, whatever that may be, they're going to try to operate this in a very professionalized mindset that may not look similar to what many college coaches do. This is kind of becoming the in vogue type of situation where coaches are coming from the NBA or personnel are coming from the NBA to kind of give that flair. And so we'll see what it looks like, right? Like, we don't know if it'll work. This coaching staff isn't delusional. They don't believe that they're just suddenly going to roll through the Big 12. But at the same time, they believe that they have a talented roster that is going to be competitive. Now, how competitive, that remains seen, right? Like, we won't know that, honestly, until they tip off and everything. But they've had some summer workouts. They feel confident in what they've got. But it's still TBD, right? Anybody, just the same as in football, everybody feels confident in what they've got right now until you get out on the field /court. So we'll see what it is. These two, though, they want to make sure that their roster is versatile, meaning that they want to make sure that positions aren't set, right? Like, you're not just recruiting a point guard. You're recruiting a guy that can, play with other people, play different positions, and move around so that there's a lot of versatility in that lineup. So that's about as generic as I can get this. I'm hoping that we can get a little bit more on-the-record type stuff from them. My understanding, at least based on how they talked with us, they're gonna be as open as they possibly can about what they're doing without trying to give away everything that they do. But I think you're going to definitely see a different regime here at Utah where it's going to be a little bit more open-ended, and you're going to start seeing a little bit more intros or introductions into the program. You saw a very short snippet of that in their first version of their YouTube video that they released last week, if I'm not mistaken. And so you're going to try to get an inside look on kind of what this program is, and we'll see what happens. So it could all backfire, right? Like, it all could. But at the same time, I think their willingness to kind of approach it from a different perspective helps. So interesting situation there. Now let's jump to Utah's commits. So Utah's currently up to 13 commits in football. This is, where they're at right now after the major periods where it was official visit season, and since we podcasted last week, I told you were going to get some coming up. Utah that day picked up a commitment from 3-star defensive lineman Javion Ramon. He's out of Lubbock, Texas. He kind of under-recruited in a lot of respects, and just recently got his rating bumped up to an 87. There's a lot of optimism about what he could be, and I'm assuming that a good senior season will even raise that more. But this is a guy that they're pretty heavily interested in, and obviously he committed to Utah, but they're excited about that. And so interesting situation there. And then on Tuesday, so a day later, you got Isa Nalie. This is that 3-star safety from Orem High, really talented kid that has a lot of potential. So he committed to Utah. And then Tuesday, that same day, you also had Dylan Waters, a corner out of Texas, who committed to give more to that secondary. So three defensive players last week. And then on Friday, Utah picked up the commitment from tight end Josiah Jefferson, a 3-star recruit out of the JUCO ranks. He comes from California. There's a potential that he can play this fall. I've gotten this question a few times, but it's more likely that he plays in 2026. There's some things that have to be taken care of, but for the most part, it's looking like 26. So plan on him for the next year, but there is a small chance, that you may be able to see him on the field this year. Whether he would contribute this year remains to be seen, but he's got a good pedigree. He's a talented player, one of the higher ranked players from the JUCO ranks. And so there's potential there for him to be able to factor in this year, but don't likely count on it. As that goes, there's some other players that Utah is going to be on the commitment watch for. Earlier last week, the Pulu twins, so Jaron and Keenan Pulo, they decided to decommit from UCLA. This was kind of trending that way for a while. This was not something that was a surprise to many people. This was trending that way. Obviously, the fact that they took an official visit to Utah kind of shows that they were still interested in looking at other places. And Utah feels very good about them, right? Obviously, you've got some other programs that are going to want them for good reason. Jaron most likely would stay at wide receiver, but you have Keenan who could play both sides as a wide receiver or corner and be able to have some talent on both sides of the ball. So that will be interesting to kind of see how that develops. Like I said, Utah feels confident about them, but anything can change, and getting them would be a huge win for Utah, just to be able to add to their arsenal there and provide that. And then you have Celesi Moa, the athlete from Fremont High, who's the 4-star. He's the top-rated recruit in Utah. Obviously, he's the cream of the crop, so to speak, in the state of Utah, and Utah is going to go heavily for him. As it looks right now, the other contenders that will be facing or competing with Utah in getting Moa to commit to Utah is Michigan and Tennessee, probably more with an emphasis on Tennessee. That was his last visit, if I'm not mistaken, and there's a lot to love there with them. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's being recruited as a wide receiver at Tennessee. He's being recruited as a wide receiver at Utah, but with the option to potentially play on both sides of the ball. So really fascinated to see what happens there. Utah, feels good there, but it's tough to know. Obviously, getting the top kid from Utah would be a big sign for Utah. And then there's the 4-star offensive tackle, Kelvin Obot from Idaho. He is the number one guy from Idaho, and there's a lot of interest in him, obviously being able to have him as kind of the replacement for, Spencer Fano, Caleb Lomu, that kind of stuff. Other contenders there are Michigan and Oregon, Oregon, though, may be cooling on him simply because they've been flipping some commits. They just got one today from Cal. They've got interest in some other guys. So there may not be a huge push to get him. Michigan, obviously, they still want him as well, but they've been signing some other guys recently as well. So there's potential that Kelvin Obot falls to Utah, not by default by any means, but as a great opportunity for Utah to push heavily there and be able to get that. So those are two, all of those 4 players that I've mentioned would be huge opportunities for Utah. It would boost up their class for this year. It would give them players that would really help their positions, or positions of need, I should say, and really work. Outside of that, you've got Moses Sparks, an offensive lineman, 3-star from New Mexico. He's also the top-rated recruit from New Mexico. So if you could sign Moa, Obot, and Sparks, you've just picked up the number 1 recruit in Utah, Idaho, and New Mexico. Really solid opportunity there. There was a bat signal from Utah coaches last week that Moses was locked in. So there's a lot of kind of expectations that Sparks will commit to Utah. It just remains to be seen when/if that will happen. So kind of plan on that one coming sooner than later if that is in fact what it's supposed to be, which it sounds like it should be. And then obviously there's Felix Ojo. This is the 5-star offensive tackle from Texas that we've been talking about. After his official visit to Utah, he went to one of those camps and told, I believe it was on 3, that his top 2 right now was Ohio State and Texas. Texas was obviously always going to be a high, but Utah still feels confident in him. You feel as confident as you can, knowing that it was a long shot from the very beginning. He tweeted as we were podcasting that he's going to make his decision soon. So we'll see what happens. Utah, you can say, is in the mix, but I wouldn't count on it. It likely will be Ohio State and Texas. Texas being the easy choice there. So we'll see what happens there. And then just real quick, just to kind of round out some of this, some other players to watch. You have Adam Bywater, a linebacker out of Olympus High. Lopidi Moala, defensive lineman from Davis High. You have Prince Williams, a defensive end from Bishop Gorman, who has Utah in his top 5. And then Teala Malu, a defensive lineman from Washington, who also has Utah in his top 4. So a few names to watch. You'll get some of these here soon. I know recruiting isn't for everybody, but Utah is closing out strong right now. Obviously, if they can have a successful season, that helps, and you may be able to flip some people that are working. So you've got potential. Sorry, my computer was glitching out, and I wanted to make sure that things were okay. So there's potential here for Utah to really close out this class strong and do well. So that's it for the recruiting beat. We're 20 minutes into this podcast. I hope you've learned something from this before we jump into the schedule breakdown. So we'll see what happens as it relates to kind of all of these things. But we're getting closer. So here we go with the schedule breakdown. We'll start with Kansas State. So this is the penultimate game of the regular season for Utah. Utah will have this as their senior night game, assuming it's senior night, senior day game, whatever it may be. This game will be played on Saturday, November 22nd. There's still not a time for this one. This will be one of those standard games where you find out, 6 to 10 days before. And depending on how Utah does and depending on how Kansas State does, this could be any time, right? It could be a broadcast, a Fox or ESPN or ABC type game. Or it could be relegated to something else. But, these two teams, Kansas State especially, is expected to be a pretty competitive team this year. They're expected to be one of the top teams in the conference. And then, depending on who you believe, Utah is expected to be there as well. So this could have title game implications if both teams are in that situation. Either way, it could be a fun game, a tough game by all means for a senior night opportunity, but still a good opportunity. Kansas State comes into this game in Rice-Eccles Stadium after a week against Oklahoma State the week prior. Before that, they have at Kansas versus Texas Tech at home, and then they have a bye before that Oklahoma State game. So a tough-ish schedule, but not overly complicated. It's more just kind of the wear and tear of coming to Utah that late in the season, depending on how things have gone and everything there. So, we'll see what happens with Kansas State. Oklahoma State could be a much improved team from the year before. They didn't win a single Big 12 game, so anything would be better than what they were last year. But you never know. Kansas State finished their season last year with a 9-4 record, 5-4 in Big 12 play. Was really hot team. Obviously had the really bad game against BYU, but was for the most part a hot team that was contending for Big 12 title. But then they decided to go on they won one of 4 of their last 4 games. So I said that really weird. They won 1 game in their last 4. There we go. So in the middle of the season, they were on a 4-game win streak. You lose to BYU, start putting it together, start looking like you're going to be this competitive team. And then went on to lose 3 of their last 4 games. That's probably a better way of saying that. Went 3 of 4. There you go. We're spitballing this as we go. But they lost to Houston, Arizona State, and Iowa State. Houston's probably the most confusing loss. Watching that game was interesting. But, one of those that happens. And then losing to Arizona State and Iowa State, it makes sense given, those were the 2 teams that made it to the Big 12 championship game. So not bad losses by any means, but they weren't able to close strong and do what they wanted to, especially with what was expected of them. These 2 teams, Utah and Kansas State, have never played. So this will be the first ever meeting between these 2 teams. Really, really interesting situation there, but that'll be the first meeting that these 2 teams have. Kansas State is projected to win 8.5 games this year. So them and Arizona State are projected as the highest according to the preseason betting odds of who will have the most likely opportunities there. So obviously there's a lot of optimism about Kansas State just from a Vegas betting line. Their strength of schedule is 57th according to SP Plus, and they're ranked 18th according to SP Plus. So, as I said, a lot of expectations there. Phil still has them tied for 4th with Arizona State and Texas Tech. If you'll remember, Utah is actually ahead of them in Phil Still's rankings. So, we'll see what happens. We'll see who's right. As a side note, the Big 12 has said that they're not going to do a preseason rankings this year. I think they didn't love the fact that Arizona State came from last to first, and so they're just going to do away with it and ignore that. So the Big 12 joins the Big 10 in not doing preseason rankings. So you have that. As it goes for this team, as I mentioned, they were in the mix for a Big 12 title until closing out the season terribly. Avery Johnson, their star quarterback, who there's been a lot of praise about him and kind of expectations heaped upon him, but he didn't quite live up to those expectations. There's potential. You obviously have a lot of opportunities there with him under center, but he hasn't lived up to the expectations that I think many placed on him, which is unfortunate because a lot of these quarterbacks, you have one big game in a bowl game. Like I think it was the Pop-Tart Bowl where he went off and everybody expected him to just have this dynamic offense around him and that everything was going to, work well. And it just didn't. It worked, don't get me wrong, but it didn't work to the level that I think people expected them. So, there was that. And then, at the end of the day, the passing offense and defense was just not great for Kansas State. So they had good opportunities in the run game. They had good defense in the run game, but on both sides of the ball, the passing on offense and defense just wasn't able to live up to that. So a tough situation all around that kind of cost them in a few of these games. As it stands, like I said, this is a team that was 11th in rushing. They did really well there, finished 31st in total offense, but really just didn't get much in passing, as I said, 85th in passing. And so it was tough for them to really move the ball that way. But you take it with what you've got, right? You've got a dynamic rusher. You also have, Avery Johnson is a great dual threat quarterback, and so you're going to lean into those strengths. But it didn't lend itself well in the passing game. Defensively, average in scoring defense, average in pass defense, just average in general in most standard stats, right? 28th in run defense, so they were good at stopping the run, but then really just kind of average in the rest of that stuff outside of fourth down defense. They ranked 4th in the country. Teams just did not get many against them. But conversely, they were 72nd in red zone defense. So did really well at stopping on fourth downs, but outside of that, they let teams score at at minimum average rate that didn't help them. So you got that. Looking at this team, Matt Wells, which may be a familiar name to people, head coach of Utah State, a few iterations back, he was promoted to offensive coordinator in the offseason. Their prior offensive coordinator, Connor Riley, left to the Dallas Cowboys, so he left to the NFL. So with Matt Wells, if you followed Utah State, you understand kind of his style, but he's known more as a power spread, some up-tempo, some multiple offense. Really wants to dial in on the run and a physical play, which really lends well with what Kansas State has, especially with a dual threat quarterback. But he also wants to be aggressive. He wants to take those shots downfield. He wants to make sure that he's pushing the boundaries, right? So if they can get that, this can be a really dynamic offense. There's some questions there, but at the same time, I think this is going to be another highly efficient offense with Matt Wells there. He's known as a good offensive coordinator. He's done well. This is a good but promotion that will help Kansas State. So as it relates to kind of the roster turnover, they lost 27 players. Most, I would say, aren't huge impact players. You do have an offensive lineman. You have a wide receiver who was their second leading receiver who left to New Mexico. You also have another receiver who left to Arizona, and then a safety that went to Colorado. Those are probably your biggest impact players, but for the most part, you're not losing a ton of people that are going to make or break the season, in my opinion. Now, with that said, incoming transfers, they brought in 16 players, and 11 of those players come from other Power 4 teams, and 7 of those are projected starters. So they're relying-ish on the portal to help with what they've got. There's, offensive linemen that are going to be factored into that as starters. But a lot of it is like, you have 2 skills players that are projected starters in 2 wide receivers, and I'll get to that shortly. And then a lot of those starters are mostly coming on the defensive side of the ball. So, that'll kind of make up that. As it stands, Avery Johnson is the star of this team, right? Like, we get that. He's the quarterback going into his junior year. Last year, he threw for 2,700 yards, 25 touchdowns, so he's got potential there, a lot of potential there. Had 10 turnovers, not great. Well, 10 interceptions, I should say. I didn't check to see how many fumbles he had, but 10 interceptions, and so still needs to clean that up, and completed 58.3% of his passes. So not to the level of efficiency, like I said, that they needed, but still a dynamic quarterback who rushed for 605 yards last year and had 7 touchdowns as their second leading rusher. So this is a player who was the best on offense. And so for all of the problems that maybe you had with him as living up to the expectations, he is the star of the team, right? And there's no question he's going to be that star again this year. I would assume that now he can make that next step, right? I think you can potentially have that big leap from last year to this year, where last year he was the full-time starter, still trying to learn and grow into it, whereas this year he can have that confidence and really move forward. With that said, though, he does lose a proven commodity in the backfield in DJ Giddens, their leading rusher from last year. He went to the NFL, and so they're going to have a different backfield back there with 2 guys especially that were on the team last year as a 3rd and 4th leading rusher in Dylan Edwards and Joe Jackson. The 2 of them combined for about 800 yards and 6 touchdowns. Dylan Edwards has a lot of potential, and he didn't get a lot of snaps, only 183 snaps last year, and so there's potential for him to really kind of take that on and be the guy that they need him to be. But it still remains to be seen if he can be that guy. You do have Joe Jackson, as I said, a sophomore behind him as that backup. So you got that. As it stands for receivers, you do return your leading receiver in Jace Brown Jr., who had 823 yards and 5 touchdowns. That's a great opportunity for Avery Johnson to be able to have somebody that he's built a connection with, has a great chemistry with, and will be able to utilize in his ability to advance that passing game. And then they bring in 2 wide receivers from the portal in Jaron Bradley, senior from Boston College. He didn't have many yards last year, and so it still remains to be seen kind of what you get there, especially as an older player who just didn't produce as much the year before. But then you get Jaron Tibbs, a junior from Purdue, who had 305 yards last year and 2 touchdowns as the team's 3rd leading receiver. So 2 guys that may or may not pan out. I would assume that they do well in this system where they're going to be aggressive. They're going to try to move the ball, try to have that up-tempo situation. So good opportunities for Kansas State, but there's still some unprovenness outside of Jace Brown. But the fact that you have your leading receiver back it means a lot of good things for them. You also bring back your tight end from last year in Garrett Oakley. He had 236 yards and 5 touchdowns, played a lot, a difference maker there, which should help as well. On the offensive line, you're returning 2 of your 5 starters, so you get your center and your right guard back. Those guys had a ton of snaps, and so there's going to be a lot of experience there. But outside of that, you're filling it with guys that don't have as much experience. You do have 2 guys that have already been in the system in Andrew Lingana. I'm probably messing that up, and John Pastor. So you have guys that have been in the system, just haven't gotten a ton of reps, but they should be able to acclimate there. So it's a veteran-ish unit that then just adds a transfer in George Fitzpatrick at left tackle, who only had 82 snaps at Ohio State. So we'll see what happens there, but I would say this offensive line should be decent, assuming that everything comes together. And then on the defensive side of the ball, the highlights here are you bring back 2 of your starting linebackers in Austin Romaine and Desmond Purnell. Both of these guys played a lot. They, especially Romaine, ranked really high in PFF grades. He's the leader of the defense, plays in the box solely, had 20 pressures last year. He's going to be that veteran leader that's going to he's going to be the engine essentially of that defense. And so that's a benefit to have him there. Purnell obviously being there as well. He'll play in the box, but some on the line, so he's kind of he'll roam a little bit more. He had 28 pressures with 620 snaps, and so there's a lot of experience between those two guys. And then beyond that, the defense, there's a lot of depth pieces that are moving into starting roles. There's some transfer players that are coming in. Amarian Forteberry, corner from South Alabama. He's, projected to be a talented player at Kansas State. And other guys that just haven't had a ton of snaps but are coming in expecting to get more opportunity and have a lot of potential. So we'll see on defense, but the fact that you have those linebackers there is going to pay dividends. I think, they're going to be fine on the defensive line with those depth guys moving in. On the outside, in theory, they've improved, and so this defense has potential. What potential remains to be seen, but the team has a potential. So the biggest questions for me going forward with this team is, can Avery Johnson take the step forward? Now, saying that is kind of funny. I would say step forward in terms of the expectations, and who cares about the expectations? But I think for Kansas State to really be in that top tier level as a team, they need him to kind of be even better, right? Those 10 interceptions don't help. He can be a dynamic player, but you've got to be able to make sure that you're doing, you're more efficient. And I think he has that potential. I don't think you should, turn away from Avery Johnson by any means, but I think this is going to be a year where he can, kind of prove some doubters wrong. I think he's got a lot of potential. And if things can click, especially with his offensive line, and you get a good backfield that's going to be pretty heavy into that, I think he absolutely can be one of the top quarterbacks in the conference. So I say take a step forward, when in reality I mean more just kind of taking a next jump in his progression as a player. Outside of that, what will this new offensive style provide him / the offense? Obviously, they're going to still lean in on the run-first attack. But if he can make, if Avery Johnson can make those deep, aggressive throws, that's going to pay dividends for this team. And then on the other side, can the defense really come together and really improve? We know that their run defense has been good, but can they limit what teams do in the passing game? We know that in the Big 12, they're going to pass the ball a lot. And if that is an area where they're still weak, how much better can you improve? And are you putting more emphasis on your offense than putting it on your defense? So really fascinating team. I'm sixes on this team. I think there's a lot of potential here, and I think they can absolutely be one of the top teams in the Big 12. But I get this nagging feeling that they're just not going to be there like they were last year. I have nothing but vibes to go off of on that. I'm obviously not as well versed in all of these programs, and so it's just more kind of me studying these teams. But I don't get, like last year as I was looking at Arizona State, and yes, they were picked 16th, so it's easy for me to say this, but you can kind of see the trajectory that the team was going, right? You could see that I didn't expect them to win the conference, but I definitely expected them to be better. They brought in new talents. They did all these things that really improved. And so it was easy for you to see an Arizona State growth. Kansas State, I don't know that there's anything here that screams, hey, they're going to be better than last year, right? And that's no offense to the guys that they brought in or the guys that they have returning. I just don't know that by and large they got noticeably better. There's going to be, levels where they do get better, but I just don't know that they're marginally better than the year before, right? And I don't know that there's this huge trajectory in their favor that allows you to be able to say with confidence that this Kansas State team is going to be there at the end of the season as one of the best teams. Now they might, right? Like I think they have the talent. I think they have the ability, but they have to be able to do it on a consistent basis. And I do think Avery Johnson taking a step forward would be a huge boon for them to do that, right? Defense obviously has to improve in their respect. Still just quite honestly, average. But they need to improve there. And if they can do that, I think this offense definitely has enough to be able to make that work. So really fascinated to see what happens there. Like I said, I'm not as high on Kansas State as maybe some others would be, but at the same time, I'm not saying that they wouldn't be there. And next week I'm going to do a little Big 12 rankings since the Big 12 isn't. I'll still put my rankings out in a podcast, and we'll kind of put that out there. Let's move on to Kansas. So we're coming to the very last game of the season, the regular season, I should say, and it's a road game for Utah. So this game will be played on Black Friday, so November 28th, at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. This will be on either ABC or ESPN, and so there's potential here where this could be a great opportunity for Utah, especially if you're deep in contention in the Big 12 title race. I'm just saying that knowing that Utah could absolutely not even be close, right? But I'm just saying the possibilities, I would assume if Utah is in a title race there, ABC becomes a big draw. And you're also factoring in some other teams going on around it. But a Friday morning, after you've got that turkey hangover, you've got potential there for a great opportunity to be able to be on broadcast TV and potentially close out your season strong, right? Kansas, they do have Iowa State the week prior. They travel to Iowa State, but they have a bye the week before that. So you do get a bye, then you get Iowa State, and then you get Utah. We'll see. This Kansas team last year finished the year 5-7, 4-5 in Big 12 play, but they won 4 of their last 6 games after starting 1-5 on the season. And those wins, they came over Iowa State, BYU, and Colorado. BYU fans are going to be really upset about that one because it was a fluky type play. It was essentially the flipped, game for BYU. BYU had some fluky plays at times, and then they got kind of their just dessert in that game against Kansas. Any BYU fan listening to this right now is probably screaming at me right now, but that's just the nature of it. But you do get some good wins, right? You get wins over Iowa State, BYU, Colorado, teams that were in contention for the Big 12 title, knocked BYU out of contention for that, putting them in a tie that they ended up losing to Iowa State and Arizona State. And then Colorado was obviously in the mix as well. So this is one of those teams that I mentioned is making that upward trajectory, right? Kansas forever had been terrible in football. No, but they were an afterthought. But the last few years has been really good for Kansas, and they've been able to make tremendous strides. Last year, they took a step back. I think people were expecting them to be much more competitive, and then you start 1-5 on the season. But it took some time, and then they became one of the hottest teams in the conference outside of Baylor. Baylor was still hotter. Baylor still has a higher upside based on who's coming back, that kind of stuff. You can go back and listen to that podcast if you want the reasons. But this Kansas team has the potential to be able to be one of those teams that can kind of take that next step forward, right? This game will be played on September 28th. November 28th. They last played September 28th, 1996. Utah won 45-42 here in Salt Lake City. The all-time record between these two programs is 2-2. Utah is on a 2-game winning streak dating back to the 90s. So none of that really matters. Just to say that these two teams have played before outside of conference play now. They're projected to win 7.5 games, so they're in the same tier that Utah's in terms of Vegas odds, 7.5. There's a lot of teams in that, so really easy to kind of lump a lot of teams there. SP Plus has them with the 50th hardest schedule, so nothing too difficult, and them ranked as the 50th best team. So, not a lot of expectations per se, but a runway to be able to do what they need. Phil still, on the other hand, has them tied for 9th with Cincinnati. Doesn't really see them having the season that many would expect them to. That doesn't mean that they couldn't get 8 wins, but I think he sees them as kind of more of the lower tier team in the conference. And based on kind of what they have returning, I'd probably agree with Phil still a little bit. We'll get into that. But I don't know that Kansas necessarily has the players to really add to that momentum that they had last year. Last year, their losses outside of that FCS Week 1 win, their losses were to Illinois by 6, UNLV by 3, West Virginia by 4, TCU 11. That was the biggest loss. And then at Arizona State by 4. So 5 teams that were all competitive last year. Illinois was great. UNLV had a great run, was ranked, I believe, for the first time in school history. West Virginia was not a great team, but they were definitely not an easy out. TCU in that same vein, and then obviously Arizona State. So this was a team that was competitive against a lot of these top teams. It just didn't flip their way until the later part in the season. So as it stands, the offense and defense took a step back from the previous year. It just wasn't what they were expecting. And so really interesting because those games, one-score games essentially, that can change the tide on how we look at Kansas, right? And I still think there's other things that kind of lead me to believe that they're still not there yet. But the fact that you have 5 games from last year, that you do get wins over Iowa State, BYU, and Colorado late in the season, there are pieces there that does show that they can be maybe better than we expect. But it's not, momentum from the year before doesn't necessarily mean anything. It just means that maybe you have more expectations placed on you, or whatever that may be. Looking at their offense, they were 13th in rushing offense last year, had great opportunities there, did really well. Their star running back in Devin Neal, he left to the NFL. He finished with almost 1,300 yards. And so they were, that was a great opportunity for them. Similar to Kansas State, they just weren't great in passing in terms of how they ranked in the country. But when you have a guy like, Devin Neal, you're going to lean in on that. And so you had that opportunity. But this was a team that, was second in the country in third down conversions. They did really well. I wonder why. You did have a dynamic running back there. And so they were able to do a lot with that. They were 26th in the red zone conversions. A lot of that probably with Neal as well. Really just helped them. So the offense was really predicated on the ground game. And so losing him, can mean one of two things, right? You have the model to be able to show that you can do it, but you need the guy to be able to help there. And it's not always easy to replace an NFL guy, right? I mean, that's just the nature of it. Defensively, this team was at best average. 75th in scoring defense, 75th in run defense, and then even worse in pass defense at 104th. So they gave up a lot. They didn't really help a ton. And outside of their offense being great on third downs, they were terrible on opponent third down conversion. They ranked 108th, allowed 44% of all conversions, and 97th in fourth down. Teams got about 60%, not quite, 58% of their fourth down conversions against this team. So offense can do okay, but relied heavily on that run game, and then the defense just wasn't good enough. There were coaching changes in the offseason with their 2 coordinators. So Jim Zembrowski was promoted from the QB coach to be the new OC. He was co-OC last year, so there's some holdover there. But the other, the other co-OC was Jeff Grimes, which may be familiar to you at BYU as well as Baylor. He left to Wisconsin. So Zembrowski will be the guy in charge. So I'd have to imagine there's going to be some similarities from last year, but there's going to probably be some wrinkles that he brings. But it's still TBD on kind of what that means. Another promotion on the defensive side after Brian Borland retired as the defensive coordinator. They promoted DK McDonald. He was the cornerback coach last year. He also was a co-defensive coordinator. And so as much as you're changing your coordinators, you're still kind of getting some similarities there. McDonald, he wants to play with some simplicity, doesn't have a ton of experience as a DC per se, and wants to pull from his time at Iowa State and with the Eagles and maybe some other coaching stints. But there's not necessarily a defined plan, at least from what I've seen, on what they want to run. Maybe they do the Iowa State 3-3-5. Philadelphia obviously has a bunch of different styles. There's a lot to be seen on kind of what this defense could be. So there's not a lot going out there on what they're going to present, at least as of what I can research. And so at the very end of the day, though, he wants it to be simplistic. He wants it to make sense to these players so they don't have to think a ton and really just kind of attack. So improvement there, could be marginal, but it could still mean the difference for this Kansas team. The fact that they were that close in some of these games and you had a defense the way that you did shows that just a little bit of an improvement can mean the world of difference for this team. So we'll see. As it stands for them, outgoing transfers, they had 16. They lost their 4th leading rusher. They lost a good defensive end in DJ Warner to SMU. But there wasn't, once again, a ton of impact players that were going to make a huge difference. They do bring in 27 transfers, mostly on the skills side. Those are your potential starters or projected starters, I should say. There's a lot of potential there. A lot of players coming in on the defensive side of the ball that are going to have some projected starter opportunities. So you got that. This roster is led by Jalen Daniels. He's their QB, another guy that had a lot of praise around him. These two Kansas teams, in a lot of ways, are similar, but different. Anybody that are Kansas fans, Kansas or Kansas State fans, may get mad at me for that because, rivalry and such. But these two teams are kind of similar in how they're made up, in guys that are dual threat quarterbacks, have a lot of potential, commit too many turnovers. So he threw for 2,500 yards, 14 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, and completed 57% of his passes. Way too many interceptions for Daniels. That limited a lot of what they were able to do. As much as you can blame some of the defense, the fact that he had that many interceptions really kind of doesn't help those one-score games. And so you need some progress there. Rushed for 439 yards and 6 touchdowns. Not the same player in terms of impact that you would have with a what am I blanking? Avery Johnson, sorry. But you've got potential there for him to do a lot of damage, but still not to that level. As that stands, you do have running backs. Like I said, you lose Devin Neal. You do have guys that are coming in as Daniel Hishaw, who has had opportunities there, only had 168 snaps behind Devin Neal, but he did a fair amount with that, 376 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's going to be the guy that they're going to lean on as a senior, as a veteran player, to be that workhorse guy. Needs to improve in his pass blocking, at least according to his grades. But he's expected to be the guy that leads that room. With that said, though, I don't know that I'd be very surprised if you get the same level of production that Devin Neal had, right? Like, that's hard. Neal had, like I said, almost 1,300 yards and 16 touchdowns. Like, that's a bulk of their offense. And so just losing that alone is going to put a lot more pressure on Daniel Hishaw to be that guy, but also on Jalen Daniels to, be a little bit more dynamic and have more passing touchdowns. And I just don't know that those two are going to work as well, right? Like, I guess I'm more just questioning it. We'll see. They do bring in LaShawn Williams from Iowa. Only had 45 snaps at Iowa, so there's not a ton of experience there. And beyond that, you've got guys that have been in the room or guys that have transferred in, but there's just not a lot of experience. And so there's a lot of questions that I have in the run game. If they can get anywhere near Devin Neal, great, right? Like, I think that would be a great opportunity for Kansas, but I just don't know that they're going to get there, and so I have to imagine that they take a step back. Then you add in the wide receivers, where they lost literally 9 of their top receivers. All of them were seniors. That's a huge blow. You're essentially retooling that entire offense in the skills positions area, and that's not easy to do in year one, right? You've got guys that have been in the system, but they're not always going to be able to immediately hit. That's not to say you can't have guys just immediately come into a system and do well, but I think there's just a lot more questions that are going to be involved with Kansas as it relates to that. Utah has that same issue at wide receiver, right? They still have some guys that are holdovers from last year, but that's essentially a rebuilt room as well. So some similarities there. We'll see how it goes, but there's a lot that Kansas needs to work with in terms of just their skills players of being able to make sure that they can be effective. As that stands, they do bring in Emmanuel Henderson Jr. He's a senior from Alabama. Didn't get a ton of play last year, only 146 snaps and 82 yards. But he's kind of factoring in to be a projected starter. You do have Cam Pickett, a wide receiver from Ball State. He played a lot, had 528 yards and 2 touchdowns. So effective. The guy that they're probably relying on the most here is Bryson Canty, a wide receiver from Columbia. He was their leading receiver with 760 yards and 9 touchdowns. Has a high grade in PFF. There's a lot to like about what he does, and I think you're going to have a guy that if he can translate that to a Power 4 level, they've got a home run, right? will it be, to the level that it's going to be just like the guy? I don't know, right? Like there's just so many unknowns there. And then outside of that, as a potential backup / maybe starter is Levi Wentz from Albany. He had 621 yards and a touchdown as their second leading receiver. So lot to question on the backfield as well as your wide receivers. Not a lot of holdover from the year before or guys that had production. So, it's hard to predict that they're going to be better just based off of that. With that, you've got an offensive line that returns 2 of its 5 starters, but it's not the end of the world because you do bring in 2 guys from your depth. They just have less experience, like a lot less experience. That was the transfers. Your 2 transfers come in from UCLA and Syracuse. They have limited experience, but they have, expected a high upside. The other guy that is a depth player, he has 169 snaps. It's Calvin Clements. But for the most part, your center and one of your guards has the most experience as veteran guys. If that's not jiving as well, now your run game suffers. Maybe your passing game suffers. All of that alone just leads me to believe that this Kansas team is not going to be as good as many expect, right? There could be some opportunities, but I just don't. There's just too many unknowns. And, I want to see what it looks like before. We'll obviously know at the very end of the season what this team will look like. But, going into the season, there's just a lot of unknowns. On the defensive side, they're returning 2 starters on the defensive line in Dean Miller and DJ Withers. One is a defensive end, one's a defensive lineman. Both of them are solid players. Dean Miller was a first-team Big 12 player, so there's a lot of potential there, had 26 pressures. I have to imagine he's going to be that disruptor that really factors into the game a ton. You can combine that with DJ Withers and some other players, and you've got potential, right? That run game or the run defense is still going to be able to be decent. Beyond that, though, like there is on offense, there's a ton of unproven talent and transfers coming in. It's not to say that none of these guys are bad, but it's just not a ton of holdover from the year before and trying to make sure that you can kind of be where you need to be. So their run defense, I have to imagine, will still be pretty solid. Outside of that, it's just TBD. You've got, a secondary that's going to need to improve. You're going to need some coverage that needs to improve. You've got to have a whole bunch of stuff that there's going to be questions on. So to me, can Jalen Daniels limit turnovers and take a step up, similar to what we had with Avery Johnson? Can he be the guy that they need him to be on offense to really step up and be dynamic, especially with more questions as it relates to the run game? Can he be the guy that sits in the pocket and hits his receivers? Obviously, he's got mobile abilities, and he's going to be able to use those. But I think for this team, he's going to have to be much more dialed in the passing game. Completing percentage needs to improve for this Kansas team to be taking a step forward. With that said, run game obviously has to be effective. Does it have to be to the Devin Neal level? No. But I think you have to at least have a solid game. If you can get your leading rusher to be 800-900 yards, yeah, I think this Kansas team is going to be pretty similar to what they were last year in terms of run game opportunities. But it's going to be tough to replicate. And then, what can you be with that new wide receiver corps? What can you do there? How is your pass game going to come together? What's that going to be? Mixing that in with offensive and defensive coordinators, what can the defense be with so few returning starters? There's just a lot of questions about this team that I don't know that there's a lot of answers and a lot of ability to say, hey, this Kansas team is going to be good. Like some of those teams that we've talked about, like a Baylor, for example, finished the season strong, bringing back a lot of returners, have a lot of production, won 6 straight games. Those types of things bode well for a team like Baylor. Doesn't mean it'll work out, but you can see the path for Baylor is much better. Kansas, there is a path where they can be better, right? Especially if you can have on par rushing, as I've said, and if you can have improved passing. I think there's a path. But I just don't know that it's going to be to the level that's going to make Kansas a competitive team for the Big 12 title race. They're probably going to be somewhere in the middle, just not a team that is going to, I don't want to say they're not going to be a challenge, but I think they're not going to be that upper echelon team. Now, as this relates to Utah, with this being the last game of the year, you've got to deal with it being a Black Friday game, which Utah got a win last year on a Black Friday game after a terrible season, so it's not that it can't be done. But you've got to deal with that. You've got to travel, in potentially some cold weather that's going to be pretty bitter cold, maybe. You've got to see if, this Utah team is finishing strong. You got to see what this Kansas team is. There's a lot of questions going into this game for both of these teams. It's the last game of the season. Sometimes, as we saw last year, it's like just get something, get it done. Maybe, Utah hopes that they're not in that position again this year where you're just hoping that the season ends, but maybe you are. Maybe Kansas is, right? Like, we just don't know about this game. So really curious to see how this goes. I don't imagine, like I said, this Kansas team to be, I don't want to say not super competitive. I think they have potential to be there, especially if Jalen Daniels can take the step up. But there's just so many questions around him that it's not all on him, right? And so for that reason, it's going to be a real fascinating game. So that wraps up our schedule preview. We've done all 12 games. If you didn't get a chance to listen to these over the last 6 weeks, you can go back and listen to any of them. As it gets closer to fall camp, I'll put these out and you can go listen to them. I don't know that I provided you a ton of information, more just a brief overview of what this is going into the season. But I hope this did something to help during the off season to kind of keep things moving, to kind of help in understanding teams a little bit more than maybe you would normally know. So I definitely learned from it, but that was my own research. Don't they say that if you do something, you learn more than maybe the other people? But next week, what we're going to do is we're going to rank the Big 12 teams. We'll do a preview of Big 12 Media Days on Monday, and then I fly out that night to go to Big 12 Media Days, and we'll have a lot of content from that, which will kind of jumpstart us into fall camp. So lots to come. Be on the watch for some new recruits committing to Utah, and we'll keep this thing moving. But at the end of the day, I hope you guys have a great holiday weekend. Be safe out there. Don't blow up firecrackers in your hands. Don't jump over firecracker or fireworks. Just please be smart. Don't catch anything on fire. That's the last that we need. So be safe out there. And with that, we'll get back to you next week.